Today, I'm talking to Brett Bivens. Brett is a venture investor at TechNexus. He writes one of my favorite newsletters, Venture Desktop, which explores the ideas and trends shaping the innovation economy. A while ago, Brett and I co-wrote a piece called Spotify's New Customer about how Spotify can overcome its weakness through strategic acquisitions, specifically one with the speaker company Sonos. We talk about a blueprint for collaboration amongst online writers, the piece itself, and what we can learn from Spotify's recent moves. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Brett Bivens. So, hey, Brett, welcome to this sort of post-game analysis that we're doing. And, a couple of weeks ago, we published this story about, a potential merger between Spotify and Sonos and how that would, fit into the overall strategy that Spotify is trying to execute on. Before we sort of dig deep into that and think about what are the lessons that we can learn, not just about the specific piece, but also, about people looking to collaborate. There are tons of newsletters out there, and I think that that's something that's missing right now. Why don't you just do a quick intro, and I'll do an intro for everyone who's coming from your side.
Cool. Yeah. So, hey, I'm Brett. I am based in Paris. I'm a venture investor with a Chicago-based firm called TechNexus. We invest in early stage companies across the world, and kind of relevant to Spotify. One of the big areas that we invest in is audio and media. So it's a space that I follow really, really closely and love. And as it relates to writing, I've kind of been writing on the internet on and off in different places for, I guess, a decade now. And so I've kind of gotten more active with it and more methodical about it over the last 6 months. So that's been kind of fun. So that's kind of the work side, and then the writing side.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, from everyone coming from Brett's side, I'm Sid. I'm a senior at Northwestern. I'm going to be graduating in 10 days, which is a little bit scary. But yeah, I started writing a weekly newsletter, Sunday Snapshots, about a little more than a year ago. And it's just been an amazing experience to, keep learning and meet amazing people like Brett. And specifically for Spotify, I've written about the company a couple of times, and most recently I wrote about Sonos. And that kind of leads us well into the origin story of how this piece came to be. So I was writing about Sonos Radio and why it might be a little case of, a little too little too late, really, in terms of trying to build kind of this, software engine from Sonos. And I was like, what are the scenarios in which this company actually, goes down well and doesn't just get subsumed by the Googles and the Amazons, smart speaker world? And one of the answers that came to me was, or one of the potential answers was, they get acquired by someone like Spotify. And so I think of Brett as kind of the Spotify guru on Twitter. He's written a ton about it. And so I reached out to him. I was like, hey, man. And we'd just been tangentially, we'd had a couple of conversations, but we'd never talked at length before. But we'd both, read each other's stuff. And so I reached out to him. I was like, hey, man, this is something I'm thinking about. I don't think I have the intellectual chops to write this alone. I'd love to be part of the process, but let's collaborate on this if you're interested. And it was a very quick yes from your side. So talk to me about how you thought about that.
I'm kind of a sucker for fantasy M&A. It's I look at it as the fifth major sport that I like, behind all the other big sports. So I'm kind of always interested in entertaining ideas like that, especially in this space. And I think when you came with the idea, you had a pretty well-baked point of view. Again, like you mentioned, you've written a lot about Sonos, you've written a lot about Spotify, you've clearly thought a lot about it, just like I have. And so it was kind of interesting to see you'd already done a bunch of work on it, and they already had a really clear point of view. And it wasn't something that I kind of I still don't know if I think it's the right move for either side, right? I think that's kind of the idea is kind of let's put something out there. Let's lay out all the facts and all the different directions it could go. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. So I wasn't sure about it, which kind of made me even more curious, because I could see very easily why it wouldn't be a fit for either side, but also could see some kind of green shoots or some upside for a relationship. So.
No, totally. Do you want to talk a little bit about how we went about like co-writing this? Because I think that's something that people are really interested in, which is like how you like collaborate on a piece. Like when you're writing, it's alone. It's fairly like simple, or it's simple, not easy. So you
Yeah.
just sit down, you pump it out. But when you're writing with someone else, there's like a to and fro. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'd never actually, I'd written a couple of things in the past that were maybe like published in a publication or something. And so you have maybe like an editor that it works through. But I'd never really worked in collaboration with somebody on a piece before like that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. And, I think it was pretty straightforward, right? It was sort of one of those things where you're looking for, hey, what's the magic way to do this? What's the secret way to do this? And it really is just kind of like, hey, let's keep an open dialogue. Let's make sure we set good deadlines. Let's use basic tools. I mean, we had a Zoom call. You had the outline sketched out in Google Drive. I added thoughts to that over time. We had another Zoom call. We had, some delays on my end, which actually turned out to be kind of fortuitous because
Yes.
the Joe Rogan thing that actually the Joe Rogan acquisition by Spotify that came to be in the midst of all of this, which actually kind of fit in well with the narrative that we were pushing. And
Yeah.
so, I think that's a good example though of, because we had this well baked out outline, a strong point of view that we both shared and had kind of gone back and forth on, commented on each other's different parts of the article, we could easily kind of slot that in, and it worked pretty well in the overall piece.
No, totally. I think, and exactly what you said. I mean, it seems like something that's kind of daunting, and um, like one of the things that I thought about was like, hey, like, am I going to be able to, like show myself through the writing? Because I do think that we have very different writing styles, and that's something I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about. But I think at the end of the day, like it came to be very much sort of a like almost a perfect blend of the two. Whereas I think like the things that I do well, came through, and then the things that you do, really well, like kind of taking the, especially with the towards the end with the ambient media piece, was just like very, very well executed. And yeah, the delay was became very fortunate for us, also because of some other talk. There was some potential, allegations that we moved the market a little bit.
Yeah, that was kind of funny. I mean, we can kind of just like it was. I mean, after that piece came out, I mean, I don't think there's any correlation here, but it was just sort of a coincidence that the next day, yeah, there were rumors of a Sonos acquisition,
Yeah.
and the stock jumped up. I don't know, 10 or I think 20% actually, something like
Yeah.
that. So there was kind of a funny timing for it. Obviously, our little article had nothing to do with that, but at the same time, it made for a fun coincidence.
Yeah, no, that's the party line. It had nothing to do with it. Um, so I mean, let's just spend a second actually discussing the piece itself, right? So I had this original idea that, hey, like Sonos is being squeezed by sort of Google and Amazon with their smart speaker world. I mean, Apple's kind of doing its own thing. But at the same time, you look at, Spotify, it's kind of making these big pushes in the podcasting space. Um, but all of that has been the creation side mostly in terms of the podcast, but they haven't really been able to do anything on the consumption end. And I think that that's something that this framework of like creation and consumption is something that I learned from you. And I thought that, hey, like actually owning a hardware platform, because they're treated as such second class citizens on like Apple's ecosystem, um, is would be really powerful. Um yeah, I mean, talk to me about like what you thought, right after that, because I think that was pretty much my outline, right? And I was
Hmm.
like, um let's put something together. Like, what were your kind of your first thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial thought is like, hey, Sonos is kind of small. I think when you think of a company like Spotify that is kind of nearing in on, what is it, like 300 million
Yep.
monthly active users, I think it's 270, 280, something like
Yep.
that. And you sort of look at Sonos, who's this billion-dollar market cap company, is certainly subscale relative to Alexa or Google Home or anything like that, and you kind of think, oh, it's kind of a small thing. How does that really move the needle for Spotify? You know, there's some small bumps that you can sort of see happening where, hey, yeah, Sonos has this, and one of the points that you sort of pointed out with Sonos is they've got this pretty archaic distribution channel. They don't go direct to consumer very well. They've been hit pretty hard during the coronavirus pandemic because of that. So, hey, if you've got a great product and you have the distribution that Spotify has, well, that's a pretty nice way to sell more speakers if you can feature that to 270 million users. So
Yep.
that's kind of interesting. You get to things like custom speakers, or speakers that are designed for Drake or for somebody like that, where the super fans are going to pick that up. And so you can see some things like that are millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue. But does it really move the needle for a company like Spotify, who has their sights set on being in the class of Netflix and Facebook and those types of companies that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and competing against the likes of Apple and Amazon and ByteDance and Tencent and Google? And it probably doesn't. So the sort of, at that point we sort of said, okay, what is it? This has to enable something else. This has to enable something bigger, or be emblematic of something bigger for a company like Spotify, for this to actually make sense. And I think it did. I'll stop there and see if you have any thoughts, and then we can go into the rest of it.
No, I mean, totally. I think that was, like I always think about, because just being a college student, like the unique perspective that I have is like how these super fans actually behave. And like I can totally see like one of my friends who's a super fan for any number of artists, picking up a Drake speaker or a Meek Mill speaker. Like, I mean, these are things that it would sell like hotcakes. And it kind of gets them into that, it gets them into like sort of the physical world. And one of the things that you pointed out that I really enjoyed was the demographic shift between the two things. So yes, you have the you have the software hardware thing, but there's also the fact that Spotify's customers are much younger, whereas because Sonos is kind of seen as this luxury home product, its customer base tends to be more towards like affluent suburban homes, and so like being able to sell these speakers, I mean, and like people spend hundreds of dollars on hoodies and like things like that when it's sponsored by, or when it's kind of it has their artists sort of logo or whatever on them. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't spend it on something that they can actually use every day.
Right.
So I thought that demographic thing was something really interesting that you pointed out. And just to finish off the discussion on the piece itself, I mean, I'd love to talk, I'd love for you to explain what the ambient media thing means first, and then how this piece kind of fits into that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the thing you're talking about there, maybe to talk about that for a second, the sort of overlap or light overlap, kind of a bit of a, I guess, bundle economics a little bit, where you've got, hey, a super fan of one product might not be the perfect candidate for another product, and they kind of come together to I don't know, build each other up, and that kind of happens there. So that's another piece that, it kind of starts to move the needle a little bit more. But then, you get into, like you just kind of alluded to, this idea of, I've called it ambient media in the past. I think it's one way to think about it is like this idea of Spotify's ladder, as how they grow. So they've sort of been slowly picking away at growth and innovation in a world where, I think people who know about Spotify, know about that industry, know that their supplier relationship with record labels is pretty tough. They've, started out from a position of low leverage and have tried to squeeze their way out of it over time. And so, they did things like differentiated discovery early on, and they've been a true innovator in that sense. And that's kind of propelled them and kept them ahead of some of the bigger platforms who have more resources to push at this stuff. And then the podcasting piece that you've talked about and written about quite a bit is sort of the second phase of that, with what they did, I guess, last year with Gimlet and Anchor and those acquisitions, and then pushing it to an even kind of deeper level with the Ringer acquisition earlier this year, where they start to really build out vertical depth across, different categories, start to, own shows that maybe even if they aren't exclusive, they can be sort of testing grounds for Spotify's new ad insertion technology or things like that before pushing them out to kind of the broader market.
Yep.
And then I guess the two pieces that sort of, we can talk about this in a sec, but the two pieces that then come from that are, hey, expanded formats. So going beyond just podcasts and music into other audio categories, into potentially video, and then sort of the final rung of that ladder being social. And, I think that's a place where if they can get to the point where they're, they have that kind of stronghold on the consumer, then their supplier relationship, the leverage is all shifted kind of in their favor. And that's kind of where Joe Rogan comes in. And I guess all these things taken together, so I'm kind of rambling, but you've got sort of the podcasting stuff, you've got Joe Rogan, and you've got Sonos, this idea about Sonos. And the interesting thing about what all of those things do is it sort of allows Spotify to be like their own first and best customer. It's a Ben Thompson kind of phrase that he uses about Amazon, kind of their own first and best customer for all these new technologies, all these new ideas before pushing it out to market. And with Amazon, the canonical example of that is like AWS. So they were, they could then, because they had built that up internally, they could then offer that to the market. And that's, again, kind of what Spotify is able to do here. We talked about the ad insertion with the podcast. You've got Joe Rogan, who now comes to this with a video footprint that's just massive. And so they can roll video into it with him. They can build a video product around him before pushing that out. He's got a massive community. They can build something around that before pushing it out. And then the Sonos piece is interesting as well, because part of the notion of ambient audio is that it becomes more interactive. It's not just consumption, it's creation as well. It's communication. It's sort of with you all the time. It includes games and education and all these different form factors that aren't currently in a platform like Spotify or Apple Music. And so having sort of an owned hardware platform that you can build on top of and then distribute, even if it's not to the mass market, starts to get interesting, because you can be sort of your first and best customer for those like pure play experiences, and then prove those out and then push those to other platforms. So that was a long-winded kind of way of wrapping all those things together. But I think that, something like Sonos becomes emblematic of the same types of things they're trying to do with Joe Rogan, and trying to do with The Ringer, and trying to do with Gimlet.
Yeah, no, totally. I think I think you summed up the piece really, really well there. One thing that, like moving away from the piece itself, like I think, one thing I noticed as we were writing is that we have extremely different writing styles. And, I think for me, like, I like the narrative piece. Like, I love hey, let's think about what's the end line, and then like let's design the rest of the piece to get to that like really punchy line. And like, I was using all these metaphors of like Davids and Goliaths and all that. Well, I think like you have, I'm sure, and at least like in part this is influenced by what you do. It was extremely analytical, and like that's something that I wish I was more of. So how, like, just talk to about like how like when you were reading this stuff, and I'm genuinely curious about this, like how what did you think about that, and like how do you see the blend of the two?
Yeah, no, I mean, I sort of, on the flip side of that, I think my writing does tend to be more analytical in nature, and it is, as you said, sort of an offshoot of like, hey, day to day, I'm kind of like thinking and writing investment memos, or writing things to corporations that we work with on recommendations and things like that, where you're analytical and you're trying to be kind of concise, and you are trying to work within a framework like that. And I mean, I wish I was better at some of the narrative stuff. So anytime I read somebody that is good at that, is like you said, adding in a number of great metaphors and kind of building more of a story around a topic, and doing actually having sort of like an essay style versus almost a memo style. I always like that. And so, I was glad we could kind of blend the two in the final piece, because I always wish my writing was a little bit more like that. And I think, so that was kind of how I read it. So you could obviously tell from the outset, very different, but I think complementary in some ways. It's great if you can be the type of writer that can do both of those things, and many people can.
Yeah.
It's a process to be able to get there, but it's actually kind of an interesting learning experience because you can start to see like, oh, here's how my like analytical nature can fit into more of a storytelling framework, and they can actually work together. And so it becomes kind of a cool learning experience as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, and I see, like, I'm so jealous of the people who can do both. Um,
Yeah.
and but I do agree, like, it's very much a process. I mean, in some cases, these people have been writing for years and years and years, and yeah, no, and I think that one thing that has really stood out to me is this idea of like world building. And I've seen this word like thrown around a little bit, but um, I think things like the way I think about it is that I can never be as good as, or at least right now, I cannot be as good as someone writing who's like 40 years of age, has been doing this for 15 years, like, has like this very good worldview, and like
Mm-hmm.
is able to execute on that. Like, I know I'll never be able to be as good as that. And so, but how can I, like, what can I offer that like I know that they can't? So
Mm-hmm.
things like, the kind of the Figma, or like the kind of the meme I put together with like,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
David Goliath. Like, I got so many messages on that being like, hey, like, this is hilarious, and it just made me smile. And like, that's the kind of thing where like, it's actually not that, like, doing that didn't require tons of effort, but it's kind of like you're building a unique like world for yourself. And I've done that on a couple of pieces now, where like I've just put together something like slightly funny. I think Packy McCormick does that extremely well, where his whole spiel is that I'm exploring business strategy through the lens of pop culture. um,
Mm-hmm.
and but I think that to the extent that you can, like, always think about, and I think this goes really well into like the lessons we learned through this, but um, like, offer what you can. Like, don't try to like out compete. Like, I know I'm never gonna out Ben Thompson. Like, that's
Right.
just not possible. But like, how can I offer something unique, even that's something small, while still making the piece like sort of entertaining, and like the narrative building, and all that. Like, I think that's what I do well, and I think that's what I can do better than other people. But I'd love to hear how you thought about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think there's like the often mocked thing in the startup world of like Uber for dogs or Airbnb for
Yeah.
cats, or whatever, sort of the this for that or X for Y. But there's a pretty good like kernel of truth in that. And I think that I think what you're saying there is kind of along those lines, where it's like, yeah, you can't like innovate on every single part of what you're doing, like what you're putting together. There's some things you're just kind of like doing, you're using off the shelf ideas, off the shelf
Yep.
framing, off the shelf. You want to, maybe you write in the same style as Ben Thompson, but your twist is to do that for a different type of end consumer of your writing or whatever it is. And so you got kind of combine those two things, bundle those two things in a unique way. Yeah, I think that's super true, whether it's like in companies, whether it's in what you write, whether it's I'm reading a book right now about Rem Koolhaas, a bunch of his interviews, and that's something he talks a
Hmm.
lot about in architecture as well.
Hmm.
And so I think it's true kind of across disciplines, across categories, is just kind of rebundling or unbundling kind of the way that other people have already gone.
No, totally. And like, just as parting thoughts, like, what do you think, for others who are looking to collaborate, like, what kind of advice would you give? Like, I think tons of people have kind of like some ideas, or a few ideas, and they're like, I know I felt this, like, when I was reaching that out to you, where I was like, I don't know if he's gonna take this seriously, type of thing. And I'm sure if
Mm-hmm.
you reach out to someone who you see, like, or like you aspire to be at their level or whatever, like, I think that's a very common sentiment. So what advice would you give just for someone looking to collaborate, on things?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same thing as like any kind of outreach, whether it's cold or warm or whatever. Is like if you come to it from like a position of like, hey, want to collaborate, have put some thought into it, have done some work on it already, I think like anybody's going to be kind of up for talking about it, up for collaborating on it. And I think it's another thing is to sort of say, like, I often do this myself, is like I'll get stuck with an idea that I love or that I'm really interested in, but I just can't figure out the right way to like put it or to frame it to make it into some kind of actual piece. Or I get super far down the track with it and realize, oh, I was so in love with this idea or this concept that I went with it, but it's actually wrong. And so I think if you can like introduce collaborators earlier in the process, they can either like kill those bad ideas earlier in the process or like redirect it in a different way. And as they redirect it, like you're kind of building off of each other and doing work together. So like, I guess my parting thought, or my biggest learning from this is like, I want to do more of this because it helps me learn and helps me progress my skill set. So yeah, I thought it was great.
No, totally. And I think like just as advice for someone reaching out, like the one thing that I would say is like, what Brett mentioned, which was like put in some work. Like you don't have to do that much. Like even just like, I think I put together like a 1-pager pretty much before I reached out. And like, that's kind of like proof of work, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like that Bitcoin thing of like, you have to show some work to get the Bitcoins. And as I simplified that, I know like all the cryptocurrency people are just screaming at this, but it's like just showing that like work, like especially if you're reaching out to someone who has like a larger audience than you, like you have to almost certainly do that. And I think something that also helps is just like showing up, right? Like the reason why I reached out to you is because you've shown up, over the last 6 months, and like written consistently about it. And so it's not that you're the only person who writes about business strategy, but I was like, hey, like, Brett is the person who I can think, who's the first person that comes to mind when I think about Sonos and I think about these kinds of things, or Sonos and Spotify and these kinds of things. And so I think it's a great lesson in just kind of consistency and, I think the opportunities almost start flowing towards you once you show up on a regular basis.
I agree. Yeah. Well said. Well said.
All right, Brett, any parting thoughts? Or I think that's, I think we've more than covered, what we wanted to cover, but
that's all I've got. Thoughts? Yeah. Look forward to more of your ideas that we can write about together. And hopefully I can contribute some of my own at some point. So
that's awesome, man. All right.